Hello everyone, today we talk about the Irish and Early Scottish army organization from the 6th to the 11th century. We already talked about Gaelic warfare in general, both in ancient and medieval times, so we're no strangers to the essence, especially of Irish military culture that at this point, as you know, was quite brutal and traumatically so, especially in the so-called Hiberno-Norse period. Today we stick really to the army organization, looking at essentially the politics and the society of the Gaels. Naturally, we still have to discuss everything, right, in terms of battles, proper, wider military history, strategy, tactics. We saw the latter a bit. We looked also at the Scots. Already, you have been acquainted with the Fiannas in general, and so there is an abundant material about, say, Irish, also British warfare, the Anglo-Saxon army organization. You can find similarities to some point, but still, right, even as relatively simple systems, they were actually quite articulated. And they, of course, reflected the cultural background of a Celtic fringe that, in fact, was developing over time, even though slowly, right, because of the scarcity of surplus and also essentially the defensive attitude in front of aggression that characterizes Irish warfare compared to the outer one, still brought to in fact, an evolution, a syncresis, especially with the Viking element that would become, in fact, part of Irish culture, and that's why we talk about the Hiberno-Norse. Also, I'm very much at the beginning of the historical region series as far as Ireland is concerned, so step by step, let's add a new brick. So Ireland, at the time we're looking at, is essentially a large number of tribal kingdoms, if not chiefdoms, right? If you consider the essence, the nature, like this dramatic fragmentation that was one with, in fact, the essentially the vulnerability from the external, right? The fact that the Gaels are actually on the offensive in the early part of the period from late antiquity, is still picturing actually a low military average, right? This doesn't mean people often get confused with this because some moron threw around the concept of modern soldiers being warriors and messing up the entire historical, military, anthropological concept. The warrior per se is not the one that confers quality to an army in a collective sense, right? The warrior is the product of a culture that basically cannot afford anything more than a warrior, right? That fights for his personal pride, fundamentally, that has surely an attachment, but because of the narrowness of the community from which it becomes. So, of course, the more fragmented, actually the higher the individual skills of these warriors really was, right? We describe, again, the videos I made about Irish warfare have to do with the first millennium of the Common Era, all right? So the period immediately prior, and admittedly not much had changed or would change throughout this one until especially the arrival of the Norse. They were, in this sense, dramatically more advanced, not because they were, say, tougher in an individual sense, right? But because they were simply a more advanced, more strategically developed people, and they had, in fact, massive logistical capacities. They, compared to the Irish, they were more politically cohesive, even though it may seem weird for Scandinavians of the High Middle Ages, but yeah, in comparison to Ireland, that was the case. And as I always say, as a medievalist, these differences are huge when you see them in relative terms to the times and places, meaning that, of course, the absolute differences, say, compared to our world, are almost non-existent, right? We would probably measure them quite concretely if we were on a battlefield, because especially within the ranks of these forces, because that's exactly the point. Like you can understand at that point how much more of a sort of professional background, like a stronger political backing, cooperation, a higher collective training really make the difference, even though the troops there look pretty much similar to one another. There's been, in fact, an emphasis on the technologistic let's say, divide between the Vikings and the Irish. This is admittedly true. Like, the Irish are often represented stereotypically as a hopelessly underdeveloped people that basically hadn't even developed its own, a substantial amount of arms and armor, and especially the sense of technology, solving the problems. And so the Vikings winning over these peoples because they were more technologically advanced. No, the Vikings did not win because they were more technologically advanced. They won again because they were more politically cohesive. And this makes, among the other things, also being technologically advanced, that however counts for how much of the 50% plus 1 of decisivity. 1%, 2%. Of course, and the more you go back in time, and the least you can see that. It is true that the Irish had a scarce amount of defensive gear, a scarce amount of cavalry. But this is a bit like saying, I don't know, the Scandinavians did compared to the continental Europeans, and saying, so they didn't have much cavalry, or they didn't have much of a training or a discipline or whatever. This is not true. Of course, they had less, but they still had in a substantial way, and because they didn't have fundamentally the resources to have better than that, right? And so more stable political systems, and again, that political cohesion that makes the difference. So the Irish are a bit the same. They had all, right? You didn't have to wait for a Viking in Ireland to see a coat of mail, right, mounted warfare, etc. The Irish obviously had all of this. They had even their own kind of seafaring capacity, not in with massive fleets, but still with lots of annoying curraghs, and that we appreciated also as far as our consideration of late Roman strategy in Britain, for example, were concerned. And as war bands, as the fiannas, they had been roaming around. They had been at times even in Roman service or against the Romans. They had been expanding, especially as you know, in the west and in the north of Britain. We will see this in part when talking about the Scots, what they came to be known as such, independently from, unfortunately, very few that we know about how these people, of course, considered themselves. That was mostly, again, a local, based on a local allegiance or something like that. So again, Ireland at this point is something like 150 chiefdoms that are all competing against one another in a hell of a territory that is not just very, definitely undeveloped, but also covered in, like, just for properly the terrain of combat in forests, in marshes, and thus developing a very specific type of guerrilla, essentially, that would be carried out by the Irish, not just against each other, but even more against the outsiders, the Vikings, the Anglo-Normans, etc. And that, again, entailed an incredible amount of strength, right? The Irish were seemingly dramatic runners, right? They had an incredible organization as far as the hidden paths in the forests, the possibility, like, of lighting fires here and there, even for enemy warbands, because there were so many that at the end of the day they just let these tools available for at least locally as certain specific places, maybe not the items per se, but for orienting whoever would have come, because they could have been themselves at a later point. And of course, there were also dramatic showdowns within clans. We will see now that forces of thousands were, of course, fielded at the largest through, as you understand, an enormous coalition work, right? Without much of a strong logistics or whatever. Every group came from wherever they came, which was not what others normally controlled. So the Irish were that good at getting out of the way, like hit and run tactics against more heavily armored opponent, and all this stuff. So namely, there was, as you know, a hierarchy in Ireland, which started from certain territorial polities. The Irish provinces known as Cogieth are, and so fifths, right? So ideally splitting the island in five. Even though there were even more, it's a bit like saying quarters or sextiers for medieval. Sometimes there were more, right, within the cities, something like that. These are provinces fundamentally that we know as the Ulag, the Ulster, the Legion, Leinster, the Connacht, Connaught, Muma, Munster, and Meath, the middle, right? There were 6, 7 at a point. Again, it doesn't even make much sense aside from the most famous groupings that could be consolidated further during the Middle Ages and beyond, to just say, well, but maybe there is an 8th and 9th, right? Overall, right? Then you have this incredible fragmentation at a local level. So each one of these, let's call them kingdoms, because they called them, at least the sources used the royal term in the Latin generic sense, right? But the word chiefdoms of some sort was based on the tuath, that is essentially a clan, or if you want, a tribal unit, consisting of naturally several family groups, households, where normally there is an hegemonic one that, as we will see, normally is also, this is the basic political grouping, so there would be superior ones, as we will see, and quarrels, feuds, bloodshed were normal, right? In as you can imagine, in this level of scarce. Also social stratification, so it was through raiding through the fiannas, this very intricate system of also fostering your clients' children, preparing them for war, all these things. Very easy to just rise to a substantial amount of power for Irish standards, right? And if you were, say, a good warrior, had a large following that, in fact, was associated to the capacity of getting further loot and redistributing it among your men. Aside from, of course, this is if not a Christian, it's a Christianizing country. So there are monasteries in Ireland. These leaders begin to, of course, fortify their own dwellings. They start affirming themselves at a territorial level to some extent. So, of course, property inheritance was so important. There is some sort of dynastic orientation as well. These family groups are known as doer-chele, that is, unfree clients, or soer-chele, that is, the free ones. And they do not have to do much with the group itself, but rather with the elite leading them. That is to say, the soer-chele is de facto the nobility, of whom the highest ranking was the Ethe Toise. I don't know whether I pronounce it correct, probably butchering the Gaelic pronunciation, or Tuizek, which also occurs in northern Scotland because, in fact, of the Irish settlement. We would be the leader of a war band in wartime. The distinction perhaps was not entirely clear, meaning that there is no such difference between a civilian and military life for a great part of the Middle Ages, and in theory there shouldn't quite be beyond an abstract categorization even today. Naturally, there were some, say, parts of the years we'll see now that were scanned as, the season, the moments in which expeditions were more frequent, so you would also carry out some rites, some negotiations, some formulas that were connected to a military employment, and especially the clientary one that you were required, especially to perform, because that was the thing. But of course, there were warriors that were fighting all year round, and the fiannas especially being very, very similar to not the same thing, to the ancient comitatus, to this also probably separation from the more, say civilian villager lifestyle, right, and something much more brutally violent in terms of also beast transfiguration, human sacrifice, to some extent, at least it had been. Now Christianization was smoothing that, but we know, of course, from the accounts how bloody this reality concretely was, and how many people were just involved in a perennial business of warfare. So in this period there were three grades of kingship that are the Ri-Twaike, the king of one tuat, the Riuri, that is the king of a tuat, but also overlord of a number of minor tuat, and you understand where's the band, what's the quantity that defines what a tuat is. Here it goes by, of course, some degree of approximation, as much as the connection that bonded these groups. And the Rirek, or Ri-Koglet, that is king of over kings, or king of a fifth. Then you have also the Ardri, that is the title of High King, appearing sometime after the 7th century, which, say historically is not particularly precise, right, of what the actual situation in Ireland really was, but was also applied somewhat indiscriminately, meaning that, of course, there was a competition for the higher kingship that nobody really had in the concrete absolute term of ruling all over Ireland. Of course, there were some very powerful leaders who managed to gain a considerable amount of support, but the Ardri was more of an ideal to attain than anything. The loyalty of the lesser chieftains to the Riuri or the Riurag was ensured by this practice of taking hostages, but not differently from many other. Like, this was pretty normal in the Middle Ages, right? Since the loyalty was, generally speaking, quite wavering, you would pick some king's sons as an over king and foster them. This is a again, chivalric thing. It's the same concept again of the war bands. These would be the new ruling class. In a way, you need to take care of them. You had to create some bonds between you and these clans, say, essentially redistributing the fruits of war by having enacted some degree of coercion, hoping to still manage to save something, like to earn something out of the mechanism. And the fostering of these kids was really brutal, right? The sense is that they, like, again, the medieval, like the young nobleman that is sent to become a knight, right, in somebody else's household. They were essentially separated from their family. They were brought into this other groups, right, of kids who were essentially training for war. Some of the single most brutal forms of psychophysical abuse that you can imagine, to literally destroy these people and transforming them in something else, and specifically into slaughtering machines. So there was all a set of, it was properly a curriculum, right, of educational skills that had to do with tricks in combat, special moves, playing, some sort of, sharpening the mind, some sort of proto-chess or something like that. All these individuals were naturally preserving a great part of what had been the warrior ethos far before Christianity. It was also adding to it, at least in the form of, as we were saying at the beginning, a civilizational expansion in terms of the increase of power of these figures, their capability of training, disciplining larger amounts of troops, etc. And all of this was felt like as a giant competition in front of divine force, and that would immediately give way to an evaluation. If you were a more powerful person, you were just a superior human being to all those who had less than you. And you had to defend that in arms, because, again, this system was incredibly unstable. You needed to be at least strong to hope, not necessarily succeed, to survive, and serving regularly your master in your adoptive father, like in these courtly rituals, in the campaigns, right? In this, there were mostly big raids, right, in which you would learn how to kill someone, to ravage, to test your limits as a human being, and going past them in terms of, again, assertion, brutality, self-control, etc. So all qualities that spent the hormonal boom and arriving, if you were lucky to a middle age, like at that time the 30s, could be like being a wiser leader, and so knowing also how to handle things, having assessed the price of them. And again, I whenever I talk about these backgrounds, I know I insist a lot, also hyperbolically, but not far away from reality, about the vicious scale of this violence. But it was, again, the entire traditional identity is based, and still today actually, like, how do you measure civilization? In power, in the capacity of subjugating other peoples, in world domination, and asserting your own superiority over inferior cultures. This is the same thing at the time, right? And this also for all the people who try to go back to some human chthonic, non-divine based roots, as if dominating the world had anything negative in it, right? It's the only purpose, right, in terms of extension of life, of power, of force, that can root back to the divine. Of course, if you start whining about, having bombed that country, that other, that's not going to be quite helpful in succeeding next time, right? So, of course, the human standards are appallingly low, as we can see, generally speaking, every day. But these people were, to their level, at least of primitiveness, still much more directly aware about the direct consequences of their own actions in terms of violence, right? And so understanding the utility and how to apply it effectively for their own system. And they didn't really have a choice. I mean, they lived with their mindset was just rooted into that. Nobody had to explain it to them. The best they had just to keep cultivating themselves into that heroic ethos and mentality. Just to make an example about this clienteling system and how important it was just to have other chieftains under your control. The High King Brian Boru, who crushed the Vikings at Clontarf by dying himself in the enterprise, had a son, that is Murchad, was recorded having a warrior band of 140 king's sons at the same battle in 1014. So you can understand here, king's sons are just what, I don't know, in continental Europe are not considered even like aristocracy, right? But for the Irish, of course, this sense of one's freedom and individual capacity of bearing arms was closer to that idea again that there was a nobility intrinsic in that capacity of bearing arms for whoever could, right? And naturally the comparison with other peoples would have left them a bit disappointed, but still that's the best they had, right? So each king was expected to lead the forces of his tuat to his overlord's assistance in wartime. So even here, a proto-feudal system, doesn't matter how unstratified the system was, how poor the system was, this is essentially the same one existence since ever. Like there was a guy who has more resources because he evidently earned them in a way or another, and he has the capacity to enforce his power on somebody else who has something to gain, because in the service of this guy who is more powerful than him can make a sort of career and aggrandize himself if they win by joining forces and managing to crush others. It was plenty, as we've seen, of oaths. The hostage practice was obviously the same, like, if you do something wrong, I'll kill your children. And so this tells you how unstable the system practically was for meeting all these assurances. The Irish system is consistently different from the continental one, for the fact that there is no such thing like a standing core of forces, or even warrior band. This is, the latter is a bit debatable. We'll see it now, but at least not nearly comparable to the, for example, the Frankish Antrustiones, or the Visigothic Fideles, or the Longobard Gazindi, or the Anglo-Saxon Artveru. Except in wartime. And you would say, again, what does it mean, given that it was on campaign, and in this sense constituted specifically by the soer-chele. So by the free clients, essentially the nobility, right? This tells you essentially what it would be like. These forces were, of course, available for what was normally considered wartime itself, right? So you could count on them at that point as, say, permanent forces. Now, the concept of permanent forces is itself tricky, because from one side we've been bombarded by the delusions of the military revolution, for which, before modern history, of course, it was nothing permanent. States did not exist. Nothing existed almost, and let's be honest. That's the view. Actually, permanent forces are even there. Just if you pay somebody to defend you, like you like, it could be a housecar or somebody you maintain in your own household. You pay, you keep. These are de facto permanent forces, as long as you want to keep them like that. So the permanence here is not, say, institutional, if not in the sense that these forces would have existed anyway, right? You wouldn't simply suspend them at a point because the political context remained forever. So again, it's all a very, relativistic way not to see that there were de facto permanent military professionals at all times. This would in part overlap with the fiannas, because while in that military service you owe to your king, you had of course to be under his command, etc. In the rest of the year, you could do whatever you wanted, and fighting also for someone else. So gaining experience, reputation, wealth, and at a point maybe even breaking with your former king, and extending your control on a larger amount of people yourself, maybe even outranking him at a point. This would be completely normal, right? What happened in continental Europe was that the aforementioned, say, permanent clienteles were recognized as already by the part of a state, in the form, in fact, of a broader kingdom with an actual political and territorially stable profile, with an administration, with some recognizable central institutions that would say, look, some of the subjects that have these characteristics, greater bond with the king, etc., with different degrees of privatization or public culture, have to serve, right, for a certain amount of time, etc., because it was a real state. Evidently, Ireland or these others, say the smaller, even the larger dominations that existed on the island, didn't match like that, and the political and military game was much tougher, just not to have somebody who would pick arms in the first place. And the most important thing was determining whether that they would have turned them against you or your enemies. Because the opportunity of raiding, pillaging, aggrandizing yourself was always behind the corner, as much as succumbing in the mechanism, right? There is news of even women being expected to fight as late as the 7th or even the 8th century. Now, this latter aspect has been debated because, as we live in a cultural time in history where we have to pretend that essentially reality does not exist to a lot of extent. But there is one characteristic of Irish military culture that I discussed in fact, the videos on the prior half millennium, right? Gaelic warfare, in which we find definitely a very strong Indo-European chthonic, in fact, feminine substratum in Ireland, because these were the virile, Apollonian, Uranian Indo-Europeans had arrived scattered the most, and so the pre-existing local cults were mostly, in fact, matriarchal, right? At least female-based, etc. Remained stronger to a degree. This is evidence greatly in the Irish epos. Think about the Morrigan. Think about all the times there is openly, even, yes, female warriors. There, of course, are some sort of archetypal representation. Women did fight in some very contained measure in Indo-European cultures as well. People often confuse like mythology, and so the archetype with the actual real persons at large, right? So it's obvious that any woman can fight, but it depends also what happens when this is the case. And what we must see here was not much of a cultistic female warriorism, rather the desperation, right, of certain communities that were under threat of annihilation, of course, to field also women. And how, right? Think about the Germanic, like the Teutonic, Cimbrian women inciting the men, right, during the migration and so on. Here we are in very narrow spaces too, so the threat was not coming just from, say, a foreign land. It was coming literally from next door. So women were just more directly exposed to this. Think about all the deported slaves, right? Slave brides, right? The repopulated places like Iceland with their Norse, let's say, master husbands, let's say. And so also some, say, countless episodes of the most radical violence that you can imagine. But still in a world that reason in terms, okay, if there is force, right, the archetype hasn't still dominated fully in this very primitive and unstratified reality who gets to even to rule in the first place. There are these powerful chthonic, telluric forces that, of course, are, say, embodied archetypically by the woman, so we have to care about them. And in this pretty say miserable world, still women have to pick arms sometimes because of threat of annihilation, right? So this tells you it's difficult. Like when it comes to Ireland specifically, you say with medieval warfare we're exposed to chapters like, I don't know, the Magyars or the Vikings or other primitive peoples, but the level of misery that could be reached by the fringes of Europe, it's something unspeakable. Like we would be shocked by even how the richest and most advanced people in the world at this point lived, given of course the uncomparably easier life under any single aspect that we live. But picturing it, like trying to understand what the political, military, and social mechanisms actually were, right? It's a completely different deal, right? You could even understand them to an extent, but leaving them is a completely different matter. And Irish warfare remains this for a very long time, right? With almost no change. There's also seeing it from their own perspective. Surely change was at some point accelerating, especially from the 11th to 12th century, but in many ways, these were worlds would remain essentially closed within themselves, insisting, right, given the conquest by other people, in what was their own essentially left space, which was also the worst, of course, and you get this. Now, does this mean that Irish armies weren't a big deal? They weren't developed for even their own standards? Well, no, of course, we have a substantial amount of population that was understood to be vital as manpower, especially because of the generalized poverty, and so the fact that you cannot gap very much numerical quantity and, say, moral forces with merely technical means, as we were saying before. So when you look at these laws, like how they organize their own forces, you realize that an average Irish tuat could field something like 700 men. It's a bit speculative because numbers could vary consistently, but the idea of a war band, right, of groups, say, managing to mobilize their own population, etc., revolved around this. This fort was essentially a territorial one, right? Only a significant minority of these people were, for example, were warriors proper, with a Fianna background, for example. Most of them were just levies, right? They were peasants that were more habituated than other peoples in Europe to raid, to ambush, to steal cattle, to cut throats, et simile. The Ruri is recorded in an 8th century law as commander of 2 or 3 buden, that is, bands of 700 men each, right? This is interesting because, as we've seen, the Ruri ruled over other tuat, right? So the concept is, if I here other, next to yours, you have another couple, right? And so the fact that this was codified legally means that there was already by the 8th century some sort of stabilized system on a political and territorial basis, and so a sort of levy that had surely evolved from the prior centuries, where the situation was much more fragmented and also, generally speaking, more miserable, right? The 8th century is a moment of gradual enrichment of Europe that touches pretty much everywhere. And so you have here a Ruri already categorized as a sort of level of king existing normally in the social ladder, right? Capable of mobilizing the forces of multiple tuat. The only, say, more truly permanent troops used by the Irish consisted of mercenaries that could be held for a less, say, juridically codified amount of time, because they were naturally private forces. They weren't hired in such a different way from native troops, right? And I'm talking not just about the Fiannas, but also about some tuat themselves. Everything was negotiated in a way or another. But these people were not locals, right? So they were under a different status of sort. An 8th century law states, for example, that a king was accompanied by 4 mercenaries, literally, 1 each to guard front, back, left, and right in battle. And aside from the terminology, we can easily think that here we're talking about some mercenary units rather than single warriors that in this case may have been probably a warband leader, for example. This makes sense as a formation too for infantry-based armies, mostly with no dramatic shock capacity, mostly an attritional one, right, of melee, etc. Because mostly you have yes, heavy infantry, but they're mostly still somehow light troops, and they harass one another also with skirmishers for a consistent amount of time. So you need to handle the pieces of the formation the easiest way possible. You have a vanguard, you have 2 wings and a rear guard, and the king is in between. So here we do not know how much this existed to an extent of, saying, having other say, native forces, for example, imitating the same array within the one of the same king as separated forces from the mercenaries. This is not to be known, unfortunately. But we are in the phase of a substantial amount of mercenary forces that are increasing, as you'll see now, as foreigners, right? Not just the Gaelic Fiannas. An early piece of poetry suggests Frankish mercenaries, while the Scots feature quite often in the Irish annals, the Dalriatans being employed by a new Neil king, at least as early as 733. While from the mid-9th century, it's the Norse soldiers to be often found in the Irish armies as well, right? So all these people make sense, because the Franks, of course, are quite venturing warriors. They, at this point, are absorbed by mostly the profits, the much greater profits that the continent could offer, but individual adventurers can surely cross the channel. There was a strong contact with England. What will happen with the Anglo-Normans later on is still part of the same dynamic, right? Some of these soldiers being just even settling themselves in some obscure corner of Britain, of the same Ireland. We don't have like that explicit information, but we wouldn't have to be surprised if that had been the case, because the locals had maybe called them as protectors. Again, having the opportunity of, especially for the hungrier and poorer, say, mercenaries who wouldn't have had much of another chance in a much more hierarchically stratified system like the Frankish one, to carve out signary in these forever war-torn places and spending the rest of their lives trying to maintain that lordship. That, yes, would be quite a pain behind, but still would provide you with a lordly lifestyle of some sort, right? This, admittedly, again, is not witnessed specifically, but how some Irish lived, and just even how it would happen more evidently for the Norse is quite eloquent about what could have happened already before with Frankish elements. The Scots intended, as at least those, here we talk about the Dalriada, so this kingdom that had the stretch from the northeast of Ireland, from which, in fact, the Gaelic settlers, the Scottish ones, that had I guess the ancient name of the people, had left for what would be essentially today's Scotland, northern Britain, as a whole, if you prefer, that would recross the Irish Sea to serve some lord there. And this is a dynamic that would going on still with the Berna Norse culture, with the Gael Norse culture also in Scotland. Think about the Gall-Gaes and so on. We will see them better at some point. I made a video about the West Highlanders, and we will come back on that topic. And they were different. We will talk about the Scots, right? There are lots of similarities, of course, across the Irish Sea in terms of military organization, fighting styles, but Scotland is also a more, say, orderly system than Ireland, and there are some consequences in this, right? So in any case, these people were available. From the mid-9th century, we start having, of course, the Scandinavians arriving with pretty clear ideas regarding, of course, serving in part these lords, if they were so, affluent, but very often also taking over themselves. As an indication of numbers, we have a minimum of 500 to 900 Vikings appearing in a Bregian army in 869, over 1,200 in Munster army of 978, and 10 ships of Manx Vikings, probably about 750 men, present in Brian Borr's army at the same Clontarf in 1014 against other Norse. Which again shows you how the mechanism of the war bands was really shared all around. The Vikings are, however, the best troops of these all, at least on average. Their quality is superior, as we were saying before. They were a more cohesive system. They had a higher collective training, discipline, better armament, and so they would seize effectively the most important Irish localities on the coast to develop them further through their fortified entrenchments connected with broader Viking trade that was mostly about slavery, including many Irish. As always with mercenaries, you want to appreciate that the reason why they're hired is that simply the local powers can afford them, right? It's only when they actually take over themselves that they demonstrate to be better fundamentally than the locals, and in this case also to keep pouring forces to fundamentally colonize the country. In this case, we're talking probably about different peoples as well. And if you think about it, that's how the Normans would invade Ireland in 1167, right? They essentially an overthrown Irish king went to Britain and asked for support, finding mercenaries, and eventually even the English king fundamentally blessing the fait accompli of the invasion. And so it's basically on them in many ways. But it's also because the system is fragile enough to be permeated, right? And these adventures basically just highlight it, right? Make it more known. And somebody has to go there. It's not the most appealing of places, again, but for especially the ones who have less to lose, it's also it's an opportunity. So regarding organics, it seems that Irish armies were based on the so-called ket of 100 men. As in later times, each Irish town or enclosed farmstead probably supplied this number of troops, who were commanded by a Tuasac. The annals of Clonmacnoise record that as early as the mid-3rd century, right? Naturally, there is doubt regarding the veridicity of the information. Still, Cormac had established a standing army of paid troops, the Fianna, whose principal unit was the Trica Ket, that is to say, the 30,000, right? So 3,000 men that would count in this regard surely as more than what Cormac could just field in the first place, right? But the story says that 3 such units had been maintained in peacetime, 7 in wartime, for a total of 30,000 men, under a commander-in-chief called the VII-XI. So the numbers are interesting because 30,000 men is basically the maximum that you find in terms, or at least the best compromise. You have even armies of 50,000, right? But controlling them, and especially with Gaelic logistics of, say, the early centuries of the Common Era, is not really that easy, to say the least. But 30,000 men, again, is the prototype of essentially a large field campaign, say, army on a regional scale. So that's why it's unlikely that Cormac alone could field this number of forces, even if they had been just levies, right? And here we're talking about paid troops, right? So Fianna is some sort of soldiery, like mercenaries, so it's practically false. We know it just by default. But the mindset here is fascinating because it still shows that the Irish had overall the military capacity of other peoples to field such an army size in their regional coalitions, right? So it would be a tremendous effort, and it would require a hell of a reason in the first place, because the challenge here was keeping them together politically more than else. And that still existed. Also, this fact that only 3 of these Fiannas would be maintained in peacetime, while the 7 had to serve, where another, as we were saying before, as leaders, is fascinating because it speaks of some sort of ratio 1 to 3 in terms of the readily available troops plus some reserves that you could call up. In fact, in the crucial time of the fort during the main campaign, and so it probably emanates strategic sense, right? So the smallest unit at this time in Irish armies seems to have been of 9 men, perhaps plus a file leader, right? So a sort of NCO, making it a unit of 10. Such units being grouped by 5s or 10s, the latter constituting a cat, so that would be the company, as you understand. And later organization remains pretty much unvaried, right? The Trika cat remains the standard large formation. So it's basically an army, if you really want to picture it. And in fact, it becomes, in time, a territorial division, provincial in scale. Another unit was the cat or Catmore, usually translated as battalion or great battalion, frequently occurring in various sources, but it's so imprecise that it defies any definition. It may have been a gathering of any number of cats, which would still make sense, sort of company level. We have, however, the strength varying between a few hundred, in fact, until 2,000 plus. Consider that the medieval term battle is often substituted, meaning as the bataille, the battle, that this cat or Catmore was probably a segment again of the Trika cat, constituting the sections of the army. So the various lines, if this forces were deployed again in, for example, in depth, it depends, right? It could also be deployed mostly frontally at this time, lined up one at the side of the other at Similia, right? But obviously it would require some ability, some subdivision, right? And if we assume the Trika cat to be some sort of standard army for, say, the Irish provincial raids, well, these were the echelons of it, right? 3, as it would be the simplest way of subdividing an army for the sake of unity of command, but also, gradual effort and tactical flexibility to compromise. The length of service, as we were pointing out before, varied consistently from tuat to tuat, which is obvious because of the different size, the fact that the term itself doesn't tell per se just how many people lived there, like in which relation they were with the other tuat and kings and so on. So an instance is recorded, for example, in the 8th century, where a subgroup were obliged to perform military service to their overlord for essentially 1 month and a half, once every 3 years, which is also very few, right? This tells you, look, normally here we arrive at the end of the, say, at the mid-11th century, so that in continental Europe, as you know, the service was 40 days. Very theoretical in many ways. Could be much longer already at that time, de facto, but at least what you owed, technically, say in Frankish feudal Europe, that was it. But every season, right? Season in every year, right? So here we have more or less the same, and likely on a much shorter range. Every 3 years, or triple time. This tells you likely how, let's say, how difficult it was for any Irish ruler to rise to a substantial amount of power, if that was practically how much he could ask, right? And this was even a subgroup. So it could be, of course, that it was just privileged for other reasons. Maybe there were other people who served much more within the same tuat. But, right, it still tells you how it was possible to have less. This depended on maybe how loose your contact was. Maybe this was a very powerful ruler, but he was reaching very far away. For this reason, some people far away were like it. But they would have probably not, or maybe, yes, like maybe forced just a smaller group than the average to leave the community there for rendering service. And this one specifically could not be demanded during spring or autumn, when seeding and harvesting had to take place. If this is typical, it explains, however, the increasing use of mercenaries over the next few centuries, and more even the actual Norse takeover, and the Anglo-Norman one, meaning that, if this is how frequently these forces were habituated just to go on service, which, again, as we were saying at the very beginning of the video, it doesn't mean that these fighters were not good, that they weren't really actually warlike and engaged in constant fighting, but that were not organized to even, serve that frequently at a relatively modest distance, and so not having much of an organization of a cohesion, logistics, and so on. Well, you have at least the invaders besting them as far as especially the richest places were concerned, as it would normally happen, with the settlement along the coasts, and leaving these other people out, right? Not even properly cutting them off from the opportunity of developing something more consistent. Now, during the Norse era, the Irish were not above allying themselves with the invaders, as you understand. There was a lot of cooperation and infight between, single Norse Gaelo groups against one another. Either in wars between, for example, this would be typical, the Norwegians and the Danes, or between rival Scandinavian settlements. The Irish were just plenty of, they were cheap, and they could be thrown en masse against one another. In this way, the Leinstermen, for example, were almost permanently allied with the Dublin or Limerick Vikings, Hiberno-Norse alliances being against the Gall-Gaedhi in 858. Who were the Gall-Gaedhi, or Gall-Gae, who would give their name, among the others, to Galway in southwest Scotland. Well, some say we're just Hiberno-Norse half-breeds. Well, not only. Of course, there were those, but we're talking about Galwegians, Norse, renegades, Gaelic-speaking Vikings from the Isles. So, acquiring this collective name of Gall-Gaedhi would be foreign Gaels, who, according to Irish chroniclers, quote, were usually called Northmen, for they had adopted the customs of the Northmen and had been fostered by them. This is very interesting. Again, remember those rapes, slave brides, etc. Well, just imagine, like in Viking Percy and in the tormented lifestyle that they had, especially in this Celtic fringe. It was, as we've seen, Celtic fringe also for the Scandinavians, meaning that these were some of the poorest areas where they would be able to settle. Well, not totally, but still. Would at some point rise the same half-breeds. We would just adopt them. Would at some point just live with them. They had this master-serf connection, or also biological one. So they would be, at the end of the day, elevated according to the traditional sense of redemption through military prowess to the same status of say there was not such a thing like a status of Viking, right? But the idea is that they could become one of them in a broader sense. Also in Norse society, of course, every person had a different price, so this was not the point. But the fact that it would be this strong hybrid between the Gaels and the Norse, even to the point of non-recognition, is somehow obvious. The Gall-Gaedhi plundered both Irish and Scandinavians indiscriminately, which definitely tells you what they were really about, and apparently earning by their savagery the popular epithet of the Sons of Death, famously enough. So these were really the darkest, again, the war bands, sort of, sworn devotees to sense of hyper-destruction. Again, it's why all the chthonic symbolism, for example, of the wolf, appear, for example, in the auxiliary war bands hired by the Romans, etc., because they understood they were circling around, really like jackals. This greater systems, like in this case, not, say, the Irish chiefdoms, but the Verna Norse ones, so the most powerful Viking lordships, and Kynfrin Torastem, wearing them out, living in quite dark setting, right? Think about even the lifestyle of the Berserkers, the Ulfadnars. They were literally just renegades at some point. Like originally they had a more functional role, right? But the sense they had to live in the wilderness, for example, and acquiring those characteristics, like their transition from humans into this beasts sacred to the deity, that from which they would eventually evolve and blossom into a divine power had they managed to take over the world, right? Really resonate. So these are very different people from the average Irish peasant. Let's put it this way. And much of the latter's terror, because as we've seen, Ireland was open, and with that, this is not to say that you would, even as a son of death, venture freely, and carelessly in the Gaelic hinterland, right? Because lots of these people were cut to pieces in the process, but they were surely, again, up to their standard of savagery from which they were specifically known and recognized. Now, the Irish High King Maelgnail introduced these Sons of Death into Ireland in 856 under Caithfil Finn, so that would be Caithfil the White, in English, hiring their aid as mercenaries against the Dublin Vikings. Although defeated in Ireland in 857 and 858, after which Gaelic sources do not mention them again, the Gall-Gaedhi continued to rule the Isles undisturbed. Right, there were Gaels at Clontarf in 1014, for example. So aside from this sort of weirder war bands, that there were, of course, more established Norse seigneuries in those areas that still shared pretty much the same creed in many ways, but also were more firmly operating. So ultimately, as you know, the Irish came to accept the Norse presence in their island because there was no way they could dislodge the Scandinavians from the most firmly entrenched settlements, or at least even when they could, they would recur still to the part of their help they had also married into them. So again, much of what we see of Irish culture has a lot of that legacy, right, from Iberno-Norse times, which is demonstrated well by a very overlooked fact, that is to say that the Irish had sort of piratic activity, not just at the beginning of the period, but still during, say, Norse times. and not necessarily associated with the Vikings just per se, right? The Gaels have been, as we've seen, about harassing the British coasts for quite a while. Surely with the Norse, this received a further increase, because at the end of the day, that's what the Vikings were around for, right? We've seen it also in the Battle of Brunanburh, about which I made a tactical analysis, where you have basically everything coalesced in Britain and in Ireland against the Anglo-Saxons, who win, by the way. And civilization is not really an opinion, and you will forgive my partisan statements here and there. But for example, in the early 11th century, Brian Boru equips a combined fleet of Irishmen and Dublin and Waterford Vikings to do what? Well, to raid the coasts of England and Wales, right? So this is not exactly about. Of course, Brian Boru is a hell of a leader, etc. But the combination there, also in the struggle with the North, etc., but still the cooperation is evident. The organization of the Gaelic fleets is unknown, right? It's reasonable to think that in Viking times it followed in a way or another the Viking ones, also because these Scandinavians had taken over everything as far as naval culture was concerned. The Gaels had been operating with curraghs. They had not put to sea major fleets that could also take on. Well, admittedly, there weren't many other fleets around, but say they weren't that of a developed naval or in general culture compared to, again, the Scandinavians. However, the ships the Irish used were built specifically for warfare and raiding, right? Likely there is a continuity also with the early curraghs in certain contexts. There is a lot of amphibious warfare. There is a lot of rivers and lakes even within the same continental Ireland. So do not underestimate this aspect and just the proximity. We will see now, especially through the Scottish organization, how much Viking influence was there, but just how much they were actually projected as communities towards sea raiding. This had been the case of the, not just of the Scots, but even of the Picts early in the day, and there wasn't much of a difference between the two regions at that point. So these Gaelic vessels were large and wooden, with a helm rather than the traditional curragh. So we're talking about the ones we see in Norse times. The only thing is that they could not have been over large if the total figure of 820 is believed to be for two of Brian Boru's fleets operating simultaneously. Naturally, there was an elite of larger ships, saying like the Viking type, plus lots of other smaller vessels. And consider even just the supplies, etc. Like it's difficult just like for land armies to count exactly how many the fighting force counted, right? Compared to the aids, to the cargoes, and so on. At other times, Irish kings employed Scots or Scandinavian fleets themselves, as they did with war bands. You're talking about ships from the Isles and western seaboard of Scotland, right? So from places where they would find somehow cheaper Norse offer, but also they had political ties with. So Ireland, in spite of her fragmentation during the Viking onslaught, compacts herself somewhat, and so it's still a large land, so it can pay if one leader manages to get enough resources under his control. And so this mechanism is also fascinating, because surely it was quite expensive to hire ships and operating them, etc. in Scotland, and so we pass to the Dal-Riata, the Irish immigrants had essentially been founding a unifying kingdom with the Picts. I talked about this in the video about medieval Scotland, a very short introduction where you can see all the historiographical uncertainties regarding whether, the monarchy of Alba, as Scotland was called eventually as a realm, was either Scottish, probably like from an Irish dynasty, or from the pre-existing Pictish. But in any case, they were married into one another. It was a complex process. All right, and the foundation of the Dal-Riata as a unified realm with the Picts is conventionally in 846 under Kenneth MacAlpin. And again, everything is very blurred by sort of fog of history, let's say, but we realized this compaction had been happening through, again, warfare, obvious cultural hybrid that follows next to the destructions. The British kingdom of Strathclyde then became a dependency of Alba and was absorbed in 945. Still, however, it had its own king into the early 11th century, while the northern part of Northumbria, known generally as Lothian, was annexed in the late 10th century. So you see a significant Dal-Riatan autonomy in the west until pretty much the end of this period. This realm had engaged not just in this competition with the Picts, but still intervening, because part of them were, of course, in Ireland as well, in northeastern tip, let's say, and carrying out raids along especially the western British coast, etc. The Scandinavians had naturally taken over a great part of the system, so that at least the influence of other Norse polities remained very strong. Right, it's not until the Battle of Largs in 1263 that the Scottish would properly get rid formally of if not the Scandinavian cultural influence, because some of those areas, especially in the northwest, remained autonomous, but at least the formal recognition, of the abandonment of those areas, this the recognition of the Scottish overlordship. If I go on with the schedule that I signed just today, right, and there are alterations, but hopefully, if everything proceeds as it goes in the next months, we'll have a bit about the Battle of Largs, right, which is fascinating, but also a different time, and in part also places from the ones we discussed today. So the organization of the Dal-Riata Scots was based on households, which were grouped in multiples of 5, the commonest figures being 10, 20, 30. So of course these households were hegemonized with local aristocrats that just controlled the local families. They were in clientele relations with them, and they went at war together. Larger groupings of 60 or 100 households evolved, right, from this system. And so the strengthening of the local lordship, probably corresponding to the later Bale in Scottish history. On average, 2 households were expected to supply 3 men for a land army, while a mid-8th century source records that for a seamaster, each 20 households had to supply 14 benches, that is, 28 men. Now, we know very few about the general organization, but if we take these 2 figures, you immediately realize mathematically that the seamaster was actually much more demanding than the land expedition. Meaning what? That the former was more frequent. Indeed, there was more to gain from sea raids than from continental expeditions, because the Scottish hinterland was still somehow complicated, right? There were wars in the hinterland, important battles, etc., but it was easier to raid somebody that couldn't even necessarily strike you back from some more civilized southern areas. And so these Scots infested from centuries, in fact, those seas. And now also with the Norse, they were strengthened. And it would be like naval operations were costly when, of course, you put together lots of ships and larger ones. But generally speaking, for mobility, they are much better than land ones. And you hope to strike rich coastal centers somewhere. They're the most difficult target, but still, you can hit and run strategically to just benefit, like to leave off this raids and hoping to centralize locally, because you have much less resources compared to your victims. So the total strength of the Dalriatan districts in the 8th century was from 15 to 2100 men for the land army, or 1000 benches, that is 2000 men for the sea master. Albeit such figures seem low, they may represent a select levy only, and probably do not include those Picts who were not subject to the Scots. Because, let's say, overall here we're talking about the general, say, availability of fighting men that surely was larger, let's say, namely, like the sense how many able-bodied freemen did you have that you could mobilize, because that was the normal standard, like in the Celtic, in the Norse, and world and beyond, right? But the capacity of doing so was much restricted. So the fact that we see this few numbers, well, it could equate, like just we were observing before, for the service rendered to the Gaelic kings in Ireland, that this could be probably how much they could afford in the first place to mobilize, right? Which is still, right, a tidy, compact force that maybe you can also keep better, right? And it's evidently also capable, expert in some sort, because we know they were active, right, at sea, and they lived in pretty troubled times and places, so they knew how to fight, and they were somehow more proactive than the average Gaelic levy in the heart of Ireland. The land army of the Scots was organized in units of 300 or 700 men, the latter, as we've seen, comparable before to the Irish VII. Later organization seems to have remained decimal in nature until the close of this period. At least continued to have a number of affinities with Irish organization anyway. However, Scots forces would have been more varied, to say the least. Say, at least in the Irish hinterland, more or less everyone was coming from the same background. In the Dalriata, things were different, because you could have lowland spearmen and Strathclyde Welsh, little different from the Saxon Fyrd, right? The Anglo-Saxon military system had been pushed far and wide. You know, the lowlands, Cumbria, etc., had essentially resented the most from the Anglo-Saxon system, influence, models, etc. You would have Highlanders and Scots spearmen and javelin men not very different from the one of the Picts, right? It doesn't even make sense to try to distinguish them. You would have Gall-Gae of very Irish appearance, and well-armored Norse types, probably riding to and from battle, but also during the latter. That is something we tend to underestimate about Viking warfare, but also about the Anglo-Saxons for that matter. Right? Consider that the Picts had been having an important equestrian tradition, and probably an interesting combined arms kind of interaction. Say Scotland was a bit more lordly and feudal than Ireland. It was a bit more primitive and tribal. Right, so the level of development armies were probably greater. So this varied ethnic background was not necessarily, an impediment in general, except Dalriad, of course, was just smaller than. Well, it was one of the most powerful Gaelic powers, there's no doubt. But it's obvious that the forces were contained, so we cannot also reconstruct them so well. We can just observe that, broadly speaking, like in this northwestern European context, we don't find radical differences, as we were saying at the beginning, right? The Vikings were not the only ones bringing in longbows, say, a coat of mail, etc. Like even mounted warfare it did exist. It was normal. Like there was even chariot warfare, possibly at the beginning of this period in Ireland. At least we see it well represented for ritual mythological reasons, but it was there were mounted forces in the story that just the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings just rode to battle and didn't fight on horseback at that point. It's not really true, right? Actually, especially the Vikings had pretty large mounted contingents at least from the mid and to late Viking era, right? And it's just wrong to assume it wasn't the case, right? So while percentages, quotas, ratios are impossible to establish, who was who, what kind of specialization they had, etc. The sense that there was at least a core nucleus of the army made up of probably Gaelo-Norse armored, possibly even horsemen in the first place, and that the rest were lowlands levy spearmen, right, is perhaps the best picture we can draw, right? Consider there were crossbows around already. Yes, I made a video about the Picts. They depicted them quite clearly, and the crossbow was present throughout all the early Middle Ages in Europe, in spite of the later revival that it becomes more documentable. But I mean, even the Picts had them in the first place. There's a quite important missile element indeed. Javeliners were there. The Irish were famous for their slingers, very poor weapons, and so on. So that yes, indeed, the Vikings had this more punching and puncturing force with heavier forces, longbowmen, and because these troops were chosen in a somehow more professional fashion and used to carry out combined arms tactics. That is what evaluates the military quality of a civilization at the end of the day. But as we were saying before, the result is not radically different from how these other peoples really fought, just per se. Incredibly poor realities, materially speaking, incredibly violent in many ways. I mean, if you know how they would keep on fighting in these regions until even the mid-17th century, you have an idea, right, that the Middle Ages or even earlier times had stopped, right? The most fascinating aspect of these troops is that these cultures is that they maintain their own traditional way of war at home, while they could adapt very easily. Also abroad. I will also make a video about the lowland infantrymen in sometime soon. And so you can see that at home, you say abroad, you could serve and be equipped also with better weapons, muskets, or being drilled within broader formation. But at home, you would fight essentially as a medieval clansman, chopping other people to pieces with your claymores and just, leaving like that, because that was the only thing you had. You had your castle. It was a sort of tower in the middle of nowhere, lording over some obscure populace that gather around you this kind of way, and always feuding with the neighbors and such things. So that's basically the history of these places that are as beautiful as, again, violent and blood-stained throughout all this incredibly and traumatically vicious military history that cannot be even conceptualized for the sheer horror of it, but still unitly developing something over time and gradually navigating these cultures towards a full European integration into the broader feudal civilization on the longer run and beyond, say, the Renaissance Europe at some point. So we will see all this stuff hopefully soon, because resuming the old cycle, everything like the old topics also repop out, but different aspects are seen. I've been making this way, which is completely random, lots of videos, for example, about the Irish, very few about the Scots. Talking about the Scottish in the first place, but I'd say that there is the objective, of course, covering all of these in hardcore detail, so there is no doubt about the intention of being complete about all the picture here, right? Reason for which I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.